as we are going to get into the European, slave trade, beginning with the Portuguese, I think it's important for us to define slavery, because it's a word that's bandied about, and we know that Africans had slaves, so slavery was not new to Africa. Can you distinguish or describe a difference between, and of course we haven't gone into the European slave trade, but let's say slavery in Africa, the Arab slave trade, and then what we're going to come up to next as the European slave trade. Is there a difference in how the slaves were treated, or the concept of slavery in those three types of slavery?
Big differences. Let me explain. In Africa, it was common to enslave people that were captured in war. So if there's a war, A fights B, B loses. The men of B captured would end up enslaved by A. And that would be one way that someone could be enslaved. Another way is if you got into debt. The person that you are in debt to, you would have to work off that debt. Again, that would be another way that people would be enslaved. Professor Sheikh Anta Diop talks about how it worked in West Africa, where there was such a thing called the slave of the father's household and the slave of the mother's household. If you were a slave of the mother's household, that essentially meant you were a domestic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so there's different ways that it would work, but the stripping of somebody of their humanity wasn't how it was done in African cultures. So if you look at the writings of, for example, Oluda Equiano, he was an Igbo, but his people were captured and enslaved by the Empire of Benin. And so he talks about what it was like being a slave under the Empire of Benin and how things changed when he became a slave of the Europeans, where it's a very different situation, very different. So slavery in African countries was a lot like serfdom in European countries. Again, this isn't to make it right, but this is to put it in its accurate context. I have researched the Songhai Empire, and I've written a book on it, which is quite possibly the most detailed book there is on the empire. And there's a source for primary material, and the source is the Tariq el-Fatash, which is one of the Timbuktu Chronicles. And it talks about 24 slave clans that belonged to the Songhai royalty. And it explained what did that mean. And this is what it meant. There'll be one clan whose job it was to supply the royal household with fish, right? And so a certain amount of fish would have to be caught and then sent to the royal household. Did you know that they means tested it? So if you could afford to send more fish, you sent more fish. And if you couldn't afford to send more fish, you sent less fish. And there's a means test to this. Then you would have, once you've fulfilled your quota for the royal household, you work for yourself. And that was consistent. There'd be another clan responsible for making the king's saddles. Once you've made your quota of king's saddles, everything else, you work for yourself. And then what would happen is there was a controversy, and the writer of the Tariq el-Fatash makes a big story of this. One of the slaves did an act of charity by giving away a whole bunch of wealth. And the story then got to the Askia that a slave had given away all this wealth. So the Askia calls a council to find out, well, what could he do to trump what the slave did? And there's a whole 10-page story where where the advisors are working out how can they trump what the slave did. Do you see? And can you see now that gives enslaved people in West Africa a lot more dignity. Oh, there's even a story, by the way, of one of the slaves leaving without permission to Mecca and coming back and not being punished. Yeah.
Greetings. My name is Robin Walker. I'm also known as the Black History Man. I am perhaps best known for my 2006 book, When We Ruled. Based on this book, I'm launching a new online history course aimed at you, the adults. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, a mechanic, cleaner, professionals, care workers, security guards, taxi drivers, kitchen workers, entrepreneurs, tech heads, lawyers, all of you. We want people from all over the world to be empowered by our content. We want you to gain mastery over your history and heritage. And you can do this by subscribing to our course. Click on the link to get this powerful, life-changing material.
Were the periods of enslavement defined, or was it slavery for life in most cases? Let's say you were captured in war. Would you remain a slave forever in terms of if you lost that war and you became a slave to the victor?
It varied. We know for a fact that people did go from slave to emperor. We know that for a fact. There was a book written by a French journalist called Timbuktu the Mysterious. And the book is about the Songhai Empire. And there's a bit where the author, Major Felix Dubois, talked about trying to find copies of, the book I've just mentioned, Tariq el-Fattash? He tried to get copies. He couldn't get any copies because here's why. People burned them. Why did they burn them? Because the book showed that their family, they're now rich, their family began life as slaves. And because their family is mentioned in the book Tariq el-Fattash, you try and buy up all the manuscript copies and burn them. Yeah. What does this prove? It proves you can go from slave to elite. Yeah. And that did indeed happen. That level of social mobility was indeed possible.
As a thank you for visiting our website, we are giving you a free copy of our exclusive 100 Black History Facts, which is in fact a taster of our course content. Make sure you leave your email address and we will send it right to you. We hope it inspires you to dig deeper into your history and heritage.
Okay, can you contrast that with Arab slavery, or is there any difference between Arab slavery and European slavery? Because we will get mostly to European slavery as we go down the road. Would you say that the Arabs were more benign than the Europeans in terms of their enslavement?
There were some differences. Now, in the Arab world, we know for a fact, in the Islamic world, I won't say Arab, in the Islamic world, we know for a fact that a Black person could end up in slavery and end up as king. We know this because that happened with Malik Ambar in India, where he ended up ruling 1/20th of Greater India between 1600 and 1626. We know that in India, Black people captured by Islamic forces ended up as elite slaves. Elites mean that you're actually working for the king. So the king's police, the king's bodyguard, the king's ministers, a lot of them were enslaved Africans. But we're using the term enslaved because they belong to the king. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But they're actually running the country. And they're actually in high status positions, much higher than your average Indian during that time period. Do you see? Yeah. And these people were known as Sidis. These people were known as Habshis. And there are two dynasties that these Africans created in India, and those dynasties lasted right up until the time of when the British conquered them, the British Raj. Yeah. So that kind of stuff did happen. Now, here's the downside. What the Arabs did, though, which was cruel, is they did castrate African slaves. And so what that meant was African slaves did not have, the next generation, the next generation, the next generation because of that. And they did subject African women.
Was that routine?
Not necessarily routine, but it happened in enough places in the Islamic world for us to say, notice that. So, for example, I am told that in Turkey, during the time of the Ottomans, the fourth most powerful position in the Ottoman regime was the head of the harem, and that was often an African. So the fourth most powerful person was an African, but he would have been castrated.
Yeah.
So consequently, he's not having a dynasty. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that kind of thing definitely happened. And the case with African women were always highly, highly, highly prized in the Arab world. No one talks about this because the dowry for an African woman was higher than the dowry for an Arab woman. And I found sources that definitely say that. But what happened is a lot of kidnapping of African women went down. And in some parts of Africa, such as in Ethiopia, they became a culture in some places to put almost like a disc in your lower lip. Yeah. And what that's about is uglifying.
Where do you Ubangi? I think I've seen that in the Ubangi tribe, but I don't know where it's from. Yeah.
And there's a theory that was done to uglify the women, to stop them, to dissuade Arabs from kidnapping them. Do you see? Yeah. So a lot of that happened as well.
Well, we're going to get into the European slave trade, which is, I guess, in my mind, and I think in all of our minds, is probably the slave trade, because it was so destructive. I think we just talked about.
Can I jump in there, sir? Can I jump in?
Sure.
Here's the thing. A lot of people want to begin European enslavement of Africans in 1441 or thereabouts.
Yeah. That's where
you have to remember that the Romans were also slave trading Africans. The Romans, once they conquered Carthage, 146 BC, they enslaved the remnants of the Carthaginian population. They put 50,000 people into slavery. And Roman rule of North Africa was just like imperial rule anywhere. You could commit all kinds of atrocities against the people under your rule. And the Romans were ruling North Africa on and off for 700 years. Yeah.
I think that's very important. I do know that read the statement where North Africa became the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. So they definitely took over and control of that after they defeated the Carthaginians.